lot of things don't make sense when you're a kid. You don't understand why touching the pot on the stove is bad. You don't understand why you have to look both ways before crossing the street. You don't understand why Lord of the Rings is so amazing. You don't understand why that adult called her Katrina when obviously her name is Mom, right? There's quite a lot that you don't understand when you're a little kid. One day, my grandpa is telling me I'll be able to help him in his shop with his woodworking when I turn 7. And the next day, he's gone. Died in his sleep of a heart attack. But it wasn't death that confused me. I understood that he was no longer alive. I understood that I wouldn't see him walking around Grandma's house when we went to visit. No, the part that confused me was why everyone was so sad about it. I mean, he was with Jesus and stuff, right? Flying around in heaven with wings and stuff, doing grandpa things in a big house with angels walking on clouds or flying around outside or whatever. You know, heaven, an amazing and wonderful place regardless of whether it fits the stereotypical imagery. It just didn't make sense to me why people were upset about that. Of course, I wasn't entirely wrong. There's quite a bit of merit to what I believed as a small child. But I only understood part of it. I did not understand the meaning of the separation. I did not understand the void that leaves in the heart of those left behind. I did not understand what it meant to mourn. But most of the world does know that feeling. And the Apostle Paul was no different. Anybody remember that sermon series on Philippians we did earlier in the year? Maybe yes, maybe no. Hopefully you have at least a vague recollection, maybe a few messages that stuck out and that are still sticking, hopefully. In any case, Paul had founded a prospering and very loving church in the city of Philippi. He was imprisoned there for one of his many infamous healings, and after a few other significant events that I won't get into right now, he was eventually set free and asked to leave the city. So he continued on his mission to spread the gospel to other cities. Moving on his way to the city of Thessalonica. Some of you who are familiar with the Bible might recognize that name. Thessalonica was a fantastic place to evangelize. It was quite a large city. There was a good amount of commerce there as well, meaning there was good foot traffic and travel, plenty of people coming and going. And Paul would be able to easily support himself by making cloth and tents, as he liked to do. And there was also already a local Jewish synagogue, which would be an easy and obvious place to start preaching and spreading the gospel. So he set about his work, got kicked out of the synagogue, which was not unexpected, and continued fostering and growing the Christian community that he had created. After a time, Paul needed to move on so that he could continue spreading the gospel to new lands. But after a time away, Paul received news from Thessalonica about how the church was doing. And one point of concern and confusion that the Thessalonians had was in regard to death. Some of the members of the Thessalonian church had died while Paul was away. Now, the exact details of those deaths were not recorded. Perhaps they were natural deaths caused by the passage of time. Perhaps they were sudden, caused by disease or tragedy. Perhaps they were young, or perhaps they were old. But the details don't really matter. The church community was in mourning. They had lost people whom they considered to be family. Death is a sad thing. It separates you from the ones that you love. Now, you all know me. I play a lot of video games, and I love them for various reasons. They can teach teamwork, increase reaction times, challenge critical thinking, improve hand-eye coordination. In fact, research also shows that video games are excellent teachers and are even more effective than flashcards, Quizlets, and other study methods. But along with the lessons they teach, I especially love the stories that they tell. I recently finished a game called Spiritfarer. As you may guess from the title, it's a game about bringing the spirits of the dead into the afterlife. You play as a young girl who captains a ferry, a large boat, really, and you take spirits around to different locations on the water. You ferry the spirits, so to speak. You build houses on your boat to the specifications of each spirit so they can feel more comfortable. You take them around to different locations relating to their lives. You make their favorite foods for them. When you make them happy, they help you with collecting resources, making materials, and doing other random tasks. And at certain points along their quest lines, they'll tell you stories about when they were alive. And you get so engrossed in learning about these people's lives, their struggles, their successes and failures, their likes and dislikes, that you become attached to them, even the ones that you don't particularly like. You find yourself relating to them or looking forward to the next part of their story. You give them a bunch of different kinds of food to figure out what kinds are their favorites. You decorate and upgrade their houses so that they're even happier. You can even give them hugs. And you become so enraptured in caring for all of the needs of these people that you forget that this is a game about death. Eventually, each character must go to the Everdoor, where they will disappear into whatever comes next. Sometimes they grow forgetful and physically weaker along the journey until taking them to the Everdoor is a relief. Sometimes it's unexpected. They simply vanish without a trace. Sometimes their difficulties and tragedies wear on them until all they want is rest, to have a peaceful ending. And other times, they just know that it's their time. But no matter how they went, it always hurt to say goodbye. They were gone, like a vapor in the wind. They were just fictional characters, of course, but still I mourn each and every time. Because in that world, they were my friends. But even so, these fictional characters only occupied a small portion of my life. The game was only between 20 to 30 hours long, and each character was only on board for maybe a third of that. People in real life generally occupy much more time than that, especially the ones that we're close to. They become integral parts of our lives. They occupy space physically and in our minds and in our hearts. They change the way that we go about life. And when they go, they leave an empty space where they were. Learning to live with that empty space is what we call grief. But to make matters worse for the Thessalonians, they were newer Christians. And even Christianity itself was still in its infancy. Jesus had given all the broad and most important knowledge needed for their faith and salvation. But there were still a whole lot of details that were being figured out. You can even see through Paul's letters how he is gradually developing his own theology, figuring out how everything works. We see in his letter to the Galatians some of his earlier ideas about things like salvation and how Christianity is related to Judaism. And then in his letter to Romans, which was written later, his arguments and theology are much more detailed, refined, and comprehensive. So when the Christians in Thessalonica had people dying, they weren't only sad that their friends were gone. There also wasn't really an explanation available for why death, or what death meant for Christians. They could try to draw their own conclusions based on what they learned from Paul, but they didn't have a Bible that they could check. And the actual theology around death was still being developed. So the Thessalonians did their best to come to conclusions, but they found their answers to be unsatisfying, confusing, and concerning. Their grief was doubled because not only were they separated from their loved ones, leaving empty space in their lives, but now they didn't even know how those loved ones would fit in with Jesus. Was this really supposed to happen? Wasn't Jesus supposed to come sooner before all of this happened? When Jesus does return, will those who died miss it? For this reason and others, Paul wrote to them a letter, which we now call 1 Thessalonians. And he addresses them on the matter in chapter 4, verses 13 through 14. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. Paul assures them that they will return, and notably he refers to them as those who sleep in death. Now some of you might have initially glossed over this phrasing, kind of like saying someone passed away or they left his mortal coil or something along those lines. Just an expression of sorts. Or maybe you find it weird. Paul can't seriously think they're just sleeping, right? But Paul says this intentionally because the death that Paul refers to is different. In order to understand why, you have to understand death itself. You see, death and sin are linked. Both are separators. Death separates us from our loved ones. They pass on to a new world, whether it be heaven itself or a place like Sheol or some other third thing. There is a separation between those who have died and those who have lived. And the places where they resided are now empty. And sin does the same thing. On a practical level, it creates division between people. Lies break trust. Hatred creates barriers. Judgment casts out. Self-righteousness elevates and lowers. Personal and corporate sin divides. But on a cosmic level, sin also placed a barrier between ourselves and God. God, being the purest of pure and holiest of holies, destroys all evil and sin. Like how fire might burn away the impurities of metal, or how hand sanitizer burns away bacteria. Sin simply cannot exist in God's presence. But sin was also in us. Sin had become so entrenched, so entangled within us, that when we would enter into his presence, the violent removal of sin would kill us as well. In uprooting the weeds, it would pull up the flowers with it. In fact, in Old Hebrew practice, the head priest would enter into God's presence once per year, after hours and hours of cleansing rituals. But just in case the cleansing rituals were not enough, they would tie a rope around the head priest's toe. That way, if he died from being in God's presence, the others would be able to pull his body out without getting themselves killed. Sin separates. And so we lived that way for millennia, trying to minimize the corruption so that we could be somewhat close to God. But no amount of cleansing rituals or holy living could erase it. The weeds would just keep strangling. None could detangle them. None could overpower sin and death. None. Except Jesus. Jesus was killed, hung upon a cross, paying the penalty of death for our sin and for our sake. He was buried for 3 days, and on the third day, he rose to life again. When we follow Jesus, his Spirit dwells within us, and we follow the same path that he did. We live our lives, and when we come to the end of it, we die. But unlike Jesus' death, which was total and complete, bearing the entire penalty of sin, separated from God, we only sleep in death. We remain in the hands of Jesus, separated from life and the living, but not separated from our God. And even this separation is temporary. Because when Jesus died, he also rose to new life. And when Jesus returns to earth, the departed will return with him. All will be restored to life. and all will see God face to face. 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 through 18. Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven, and with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with trumpets, the trumpet call of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them and the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. Both sin and death are separators. But with Jesus, both lost some of their ability to separate. Sin is no longer a vital part of us. It remains alive, but it has no roots. It can hide in the shadows of the heart, but it will burn up if we allow the sun to burn it. And it will no longer take us with it. And death has lost its sting. No longer permanent, and no longer separated from God. See, there are a lot of things that little kids don't understand. But there are a lot of things that they do. Little Corey may not have understood the bad stuff, the separation and the mourning, but he got one thing dead on. Death is not an evil and bad thing. For those who sleep in death are committed to the safe and warm hands of Jesus until we are all reunited again with